about decentralization, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about blockchains. I'm sure people have heard about Bitcoin, have heard about Ethereum. But what I wanted to do is, first of all, put some of these ideas into context and talk about the different kinds of decentralization that we have, and the reasons why decentralization is a good idea, the reason why different kinds of decentralization make sense in some areas, why different kinds of decentralization don't make sense in other areas, and then start to see how these ideas and the benefits that you can get from these ideas make sense, particularly in the energy industry. So, first of all, I wanted to point out that decentralization in general is not a new idea, right? I mean, we've had human civilization for over 10,000 years, and over the last 10,000 years, we've had lots of instances of centralized things, centralized systems, centralized companies, centralized governments, centralized cities, and we've had lots of instances of decentralized things. And, I mean, these are just some instances of decentralized applications in the software industry in the last 15 years. But really, it's also important to point out that, even before we've had computers, even before we've had IT, we've had various instances of decentralized economies, decentralized ways of interacting. So if you just look at one particular example, just look at the insurance industry, for example. Right now we have large insurance companies, and if you have insurance, you generally have insurance either because it's some national government program or because you're buying a service from some insurance company that sells insurance as a product to very large numbers of people. But the way that the insurance industry started in many cases actually was, groups of people coming together and saying, okay, we each have a ship, and if any one of our ships sinks or gets captured by a pirate, then we all agree to cover each other's costs. So, decentralized models is something that's existed for quite a while. Right now, if we look at the software industry in particular, we've had BitTorrent is just one example. We've had decentralized networks for sending files from one computer to another. If you look at email, it's in some ways it's a semi-decentralized protocol. You can access email through Gmail or through Microsoft's email or through some other email service, or theoretically, if you really wanted to, you could set up your own server. If you want to download some file, then BitTorrent is one great way to do that. And it's, in fact, it's something that a lot of software developers even use as a primary way of distributing data that they produce to their users. Right, so if you use open source software packages, generally the developers don't even have the resources to actually set up and maintain the infrastructure to centrally upload and send their software to tens of millions of users. And a lot of the time, they even use decentralized networks as a way of solving the problem. If anyone's ever downloaded Ubuntu, you know that they really try and push you toward using a decentralized network, and basically instead of downloading the software from them, downloading the software from your peers. Your users become part of your network. And even at the same time as they download the software, they help kind of pass the software along to their friends. So that's also a model that a lot of major gaming providers use to distribute patches, distribute updates to their games to their users. It's a paradigm that gets used increasingly for messaging, for storing files. So it's something that has already been used for quite a while. Right now, 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto came up with the idea behind Bitcoin, and here, finally, he's come up with a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Right, so computer scientists, cypherpunks, lots of people have been interested in these ideas of decentralizing things for quite a while, but for the one major application that they've had a really hard time with is actually money. Right, so they figured out how to do decentralized messaging, figured out how to send files, but currency is this one application that, for reasons that I am going to get into, ended up taking them quite a long time. So, back in the 1980s, back in the 1990s, there have been various forms of kind of cryptographic e-money, but coming up with a version that doesn't rely on one central party to kind of manage the whole system actually proved to be quite challenging. So, Ethereum, that's the project that I'm working on, and the goal basically is to take the ideas behind Bitcoin, the technology, the blockchain, and try and make it more generalized, right? Try to come up with a kind of architecture that you can use to build decentralized applications in a very general sense. So, it's an area that's fairly rapidly moving forward, right? But it's important to also ask the question, what is decentralization? And, why do we want it? What are the benefits? What are we trying to get out of this, right? So, there have been lots of people trying to define the word, and there have been lots of people trying to kind of define decentralized, define distributed, define kind of what the difference between the two is. In my opinion, most people that are trying to do this tend to not come up with particularly good classifications, and, basically there's probably more people who think decentralized and distributed are synonyms than there are people who agree on any particular way of categorizing the difference. So, I'm probably going to go straight into my own classification, which I think is better than everyone else's. And I generally break down decentralization into 3 parts, right? So I talk about, first of all, architectural decentralization, which basically means, is it one physical system, or is it many physical systems? Does everything depend on one particular computer, one particular root server, one particular kind of central architecture for managing things? Or is it kind of spread out across many computers or many systems where if even a small portion of any of them go offline or get hacked, the rest of the system still keeps working? The next kind of decentralization is political decentralization, right? So the idea here basically is it's not just about the physical architecture, the physical distribution, it's about control. Is the system, is your protocol controlled by one person, one entity, or is it controlled by kind of everyone together? The third kind of decentralization is logical decentralization. So this basically means, is the system that you're creating, does it kind of look like one single thing? So does it create a singleton, does it create kind of one single object? Or does it look more like an amorphous swarm? Now, the third one is kind of a bit harder to understand in many cases, but I'll give a few examples, and hopefully it'll start to become clearer. So, I tend to kind of make this kind of chart, and you can come up with various different combinations of this. Some of these combinations are harder to get than other combinations. So, if one quick example is if you look at, let's say, a direct democracy, then chances it's architecturally centralized because you have one parliament where or you have a lot of central government buildings where decisions are being made. You have police, you have military, but at the same time it's more politically decentralized because even though there are kind of a few chambers, there's still the actual decision-making power is still fairly widely spread among large groups of people. It's also logically centralized because there is one government. It does kind of create one set of laws. Now, if you look on the other extreme, look at something like the English language. It's politically decentralized. No one controls it. It's architecturally decentralized. There is kind of no one single place where it's taught. There's no one single place where it gets created. And it's also logically decentralized. And what I mean by that is, the English language spoken by people in one part of the world and the English language spoken in other parts of the world may well actually be different, right? So, you could easily have different, even English speakers actually disagree on, what a few words, on the meanings of a few words, on how they use a few words, but even still it roughly works, right? But meanwhile, in other cases, for the blockchain, you have something which is architecturally decentralized, politically decentralized, but it is logically centralized. And I would argue that actually has benefits, right? So, quite a lot of the time when people talk about blockchains, they actually talk about the benefits of kind of having everything be in a single database instead of having, every single bank or every single institution have their own database and then having some very complex and very inefficient processes for reconciling between them. So I would argue logical centralization in many cases actually does have benefits, right? So now I personally believe that, these kinds of decentralization have benefits in various different situations. And sometimes you might want logical decentralization, sometimes you might want logical centralization. And sometimes a blockchain isn't necessarily the right tool for you. But, in some cases it is. And in those cases where it is, I hope we can kind of work together and figure out what is the best way and the best place to use them. So, why decentralize is the next question. And here I have another kind of categorization, and I split it up into a few different reasons, right? So, one reason is just simple efficiency. So, in some cases, making a system be decentralized actually just is the most efficient way to build it. In some cases, you want to have decentralized production because your customers are decentralized and you want to have, one producer be close to every possible set of customers, right? You want the physical distribution of, let's say, restaurants is something that really obviously should be decentralized, because if all the restaurants were in one city, then everyone would have to drive 500 kilometers every time they want to go to a restaurant. So that's just one trivial example where decentralization does make things more efficient, right? Now, there are also other reasons. So, for example, spare capacity considerations. When people talk about the efficiencies that you can get with things like Uber and Airbnb, what are they talking about? There are people who already have their own cars, they have people who already have their own, houses, and they have kind of resources that they're only using some of the time, right? They have kind of unused spare capacity. And the idea is that you can get kind of extra efficiencies because instead of having to build new infrastructure specifically for the purpose of, renting it out for a day or giving people taxi rides, you can kind of use spare capacity in infrastructure that already exists, right? So this is one set of advantages. Another set of advantages has to do with fault tolerance. So, decentralized systems, or any system, has some risk of breaking, but decentralized systems are less likely to break. There isn't kind of one single thing where if the one single thing breaks, then the entire internet goes down. Then a third argument is attack resistance, right? So with attack resistance, it's basically a matter of thinking, how hard is it to take the system to bring the system down? How hard is it to cause the system to misbehave? And basically the idea is that if you try and build systems that have kind of very expensive sensors, then even if you spend 100 times more resources making your sensor, it's not going to take 100 times more resources to attack, right? Like basically, the more you kind of bring different components together into kind of one highly centralized thing, in fact, the easier it is to cause that system to break, the easier it is to disrupt it. And if you want to build something that's stable, then you actually want to try to kind of distribute it out among as many different components as possible. Now, another argument is collusion resistance. So this is one where political decentralization really starts coming to the forefront. And basically, the way that I think about it is as a way of it's about making it more difficult for one particular subgroup of a community or of a market or of an ecosystem to come together and act in its own benefit at everyone else's expense. Right? So the simplest example is, you really want to avoid having monopolies, right? Because if you have a monopoly, then everyone who owns the monopoly will be able to kind of raise prices, get some higher profits. But from the point of view of the ecosystem, from the point of view of the community in general, prices go up. There's lots of activities that really should be possible but stop being possible because prices go higher, and it's generally bad for the economy. Now, monopolies can do lots of things other than raising prices, and some of them in the long term might even be more dangerous, and we can go into that a bit too. Right? So, these are some of the reasons why decentralized systems make sense. And I think a lot of these are reasons that people here should be able to relate to, right? So from the point of view of efficiency, I mean, people are, I personally admit I do not know enough about the solar industry to be able to kind of personally endorse this article, but this is something that people are talking about. This is something that you hear people thinking about a lot. This idea that forms of energy production like solar and wind are kind of become more efficient if you decentralize them, right? Become more efficient if you create this ecosystem where instead of relying on a few large firms to provide all the electricity, you would basically let people put solar panels on the rooftops, put windmills on the rooftops, and create this economy where not only do you have millions of consumers, but you also have millions of producers. So, Airbnb for cloud storage. So this is, I brought up the kind of Uber and Airbnb spare capacity arguments earlier, and this is something that people are looking to try to do in other industries as well, right? So there's a lot of kind of blockchain-based decentralized storage or decentralized computation startups, and they're basically trying to kind of leverage spare capacity in the same way as well. Another natural use case is content delivery networks. So, if you as a user try to access a website, where is the computer that's serving the website to you? The closer there is, you can find a server to yourself, the faster you're going to get the site. So that's one area where decentralization makes sense as well. So that's one example. Now, from the point of view of fault tolerance, here's a interesting article from a few years ago. And basically what this is saying is that if you look at the decisions made by the United States Supreme Court, and if you look at the citations that they make, for every time they have a link and you try to follow the link, 49% of the time that link is broken. Now, why is the link broken? Basically because the way that linking to data on the internet works is that it's a fundamentally centralized paradigm, right? It's a paradigm where the first part of the link says what website you have to go to, basically what server you talk to, and the second part of the link says what do you ask them, right? So problem is, what if the original server goes down, right? Chances are if you write something, 5 years later you might forget about it, or you might put it up on some blogging platform, and 5 years later the blogging platform shuts down, and what do you do then? So there are, one of the companies that I kind of very briefly mentioned earlier on is IPFS, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to make a more decentralized standard for this, where instead of linking to a piece of data by which particular server is supposed to host it, you would link to a piece of data by making a hash, making a cryptographic pointer to what that specific piece of data is. And as long as there is at least one computer on the internet that hosts it, as long as there is one computer on the internet somewhere that has the data and that's willing to send it to you, you would be able to get the data back, right? So this is one practical example of how decentralization, and even specifically even how political decentralization too, can get you fault tolerance. Power outages, right? So power outages right now is one example of how centralization can lead to fragility as well. Now, attack resistance. So from attack resistance, another example of one of the kind of major dangers of centralization. And here, basically this is something that happened about 5 years ago, and this is about another piece of our internet infrastructure that ended up being quite centralized. And basically it's certificate authorities, right? So it's the companies that, if you access some major website, like whether it's Google or whether it's some major bank, if you access them through HTTPS, you get that kind of green lock in your browser that says that this actually is that website and it's not some hacker that managed to kind of man in the middle of your connection. Well, the companies that actually provide the kind of certificates, the public keys that make that system work, one of those companies got hacked a few years ago, and basically a huge number of websites suddenly became vulnerable, right? So this is another thing that there's quite a lot of people that are looking to see if they can decentralize. Here's another instance of centralization being dangerous. So, this is actually one very high-profile example, but there have been quite a few examples of this probably over the last 3 or 4 years. In general, when you have points of centralization become points of central data collection. And a point of central data collection is something that can get attacked and it can lead to very large data leaks very easily. Right now we have data leaks almost everywhere. Basically, if you use some online service, you can expect with high probability that anything you do inside of that service will, at some point years from now, get leaked, and the world will have access to it. So it's basically over here, we have. This was a particularly high-profile example because this website basically was a kind of a dating site for people to have affairs, and you can expect that if people have affairs, they'd want their affairs to be kept private. And the site got hacked, and a few million people got very nasty surprises. So now, it's also, I think, important to keep in mind that there's two kinds of costs to failures of centralized systems. One of them is kind of the scene, which is basically security losses, faults that happen due to existing over-centralization. And the other kind of cost that I want to bring up is the unseen. So what do I mean by the unseen? Basically, unrealized gains, efficiency gains that do not happen because people are afraid of upgrading to network-enabled technologies. Basically, because these network-enabled technologies right now are insecure because right now they're not centralized. One very simple example, online voting. Practically speaking, the fact that in the 21st century we still use pen and paper to vote, in some cases it's archaic and I'd argue it's highly inefficient, and to a 21st century person like me, it's pathetic. But on the other hand, you see how, if you're, a lot of the reasons why people are afraid of switching to a more electronic version is precisely because they're afraid of a huge number of very real security risks, right? So, that's just one example of what I would call the kind of the unseen costs of bad cybersecurity. So, collusion resistance, basically, monopolies, right? Monopolies are bad. So, the ways that monopolies are bad tend to be fairly subtle as well. So, you have one of the main kind of issues that you have is sort of bait and switch attacks, where people and entrepreneurs, businesses, people end up making themselves dependent on one particular centralized provider, and then the way that that centralized provider works just suddenly ends up switching on you, right? So people make startups that are based around Twitter APIs, and then Twitter changes their policies, and your business model is gone overnight. So one solution to all these problems is federation, right? So you can build protocols where instead of relying on one particular centralized provider, you would have this protocol where you could rely on a set of centralized providers. And the idea basically would be that anyone would be able to set up one of these servers, and anyone could use which server they personally want, and people that use different servers will be able to talk to each other. Now, one of the problems of this is that it's a kind of market equilibrium that's proved to be very hard to sustain. Basically because as soon as there is any dominant provider, they're going to have the incentive to embrace extend and extinguish, right? They're going to have the incentive to start making proprietary extensions, to make themselves incompatible with everyone else, and basically try and turn the whole thing back into a centralized system again. Another problem is that in general, in federated, people have tried making federated protocols. So the Diaspora Protocol is meant to be a federated social network, a federated alternative to Facebook. And what ended up happening is that the largest server that people set up, so the largest server there is joindiaspora.org, ended up getting about a 50% market share, right? So federation is a solution that does have lots of challenges. Now, fully decentralized open protocols is one of those one other solution that might make more sense. And blockchains are one example. Blockchains don't rely on people kind of choosing one particular server. Blockchains actually do rely are kind of protocols that work without any one particular centralized intermediary being necessary. So how do these ideas fit into the energy industry, right? So first of all, you have to think about what it is that you're trying to decentralize. So in general, I mean, you have production of energy, and who's producing the energy, whether it's coal, nuclear, solar, wind, it's produced by somebody, and the producers might be centralized, they might be decentralized. Distribution, so the wires basically, and I would also add to the distribution things like energy storage, infrastructure, source authentication. So some people care about whether or not their energy is green. People care about whether or not might care about whether or not their energy is financing any nasty dictators, and also market mechanisms, right? So basically allocation and incentivization. So these are all things that you might think about kind of being areas where decentralization might make sense. Now, the next question is where blockchains actually make sense, right? So blockchains seem like they're generally a very good infrastructure for building markets, but I think we can also think about source authentication. We can also think about supply chain tracking, think about supply verification, and those kinds of use cases as well. So markets are interesting because in some ways markets, even as they are already a kind of incentivized distributed computation algorithm, right? So there are sort of areas where sort of decentralized computation is in some kind of very implicit sense happening now. But the question is, can we actually can we kind of build on this and build decentralized market infrastructures that are even better? So markets in general are stateful in the sense that they are kind of fairly complex infrastructures or fairly complex mechanisms that often do have kind of some notion of internal state. They have to remember kind of some notion of internal information. So if decentralization makes sense, then blockchains may well be part of the solution, right? So how could decentralization help? I mean, one area where it might help is fairness. So in market designs, proving that these market designs are fair, that's 60 years worth of math, game theory, all sorts of fairly complicated research. But what blockchains can do is they can prove that the algorithm that people think is being used is the algorithm that actually is being executed. Also privacy preservation. So in general, points of centralization become points of central data collection, and in general, blockchains don't provide privacy by themselves, but if you combine them with strong cryptography and with decentralization as a holistic principle, then you can create architectures that do a much better job of preserving privacy. Now, why preserve privacy? I mean, I think it's important to kind of underscore the point that privacy isn't just about Big Brother paranoia. Like, privacy is also kind of a critical requirement for incentive compatibility of many classes of mechanisms, right? So like it's in many cases a key part of making sure that markets work. So with that, I wanted to say thank you and look forward to seeing what everyone